The future is complicated because the present is very complicated. Things are not going as we want them to go. And the number of challenges and crises seems only to multiply right now. And this is a paradox because at the same time, our tools for addressing challenges are greater than ever. We're in the midst of really a cornucopia of solutions. We're in the midst of breakthroughs in technology that really, truly are amazing, at least in my view. The Nobel Prizes in the last week were quite impressive in chemistry, in physics. They were about the artificial intelligence revolution. And the chemistry Nobel Prize, I think, is especially notable. It was won by a non-chemist or two non-chemists who were computer scientists. I don't know if they know any chemistry, but they solved one of the greatest challenges of modern chemistry that seemed almost unsolvable, and that was protein folding. That was the breakthrough of DeepMind that used artificial intelligence to solve a problem that was taking decades of the world's most sophisticated biochemists, who were often spending their whole career on understanding how a few proteins folded, important proteins, insulin or others, and a whole career on trying to understand the chemistry. And then within a very short period of time, DeepMind applied deep neural networks and cracked the code. Not completely, but now there is an untold wealth of knowledge about protein folding that can be used for countless applications in drug development, which is the next challenge that DeepMind is taking on. And this won a Nobel Prize just a few years after its implementation. To my mind, that is really a good sign of what we could be accomplishing. And yet, we have a genocide going on in front of our eyes in Gaza and in its expanding war, and we seem incapable of doing anything. To go from the sublime of deep neural networks to the tragedy of our incapacity. I just read a moment ago that the United States announced that if Israel doesn't stop its attacks on the abuses in Gaza, in 1 month, the U.S. may start curtailing the weapons. This is pathetic. Why a month? Well, that would put us well past the election. They don't want to do anything before the election. No matter how many people killed, no matter how many Israeli tanks roll into UN peacekeeper sites, no matter how many hospitals and schools and universities are bombed, no matter how many countries are attacked, no matter how many political assassinations, including assassinations of the counterparts that are engaged in the ceasefire negotiations, rather than have a ceasefire, kill the negotiator negotiating the ceasefire. And what do we have? We have a declaration at this point, well, in a month we may do something by the country that provides all the weapons and the armaments. This is our reality. What a world. The greatest breakthroughs imaginable in technology and the greatest barbarism in using those technologies at the same time, and an almost incapacity to address any issue honestly when it comes to collective action. So this is what we're facing. This is why there was a Summit of the Future last month at the UN. It was a creative call by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, but it was also a kind of call of desperation, I would say. The UN isn't working. It's not. It works as an organization. I do find it still inspiring for me. I spend most of my time working for the UN on a volunteer basis. And I do it because I'm inspired by the idea of the nations of the world working together. And I like the fact that every September world leaders come and they speak, and you can listen to them, but whether they're heard by others is another question. I like the idea that we have international organizations like the food-based organizations that Italy hosts, FAO and the World Food Program and IFAD, or that we have something as wonderful as the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. What a wonderful idea to bring science, education, and culture together in UNESCO. That's the one that the United States has walked out of 2 times to show, again, the high aspiration and the grim reality. So the call for a summit of the future was a call by the Secretary General to discuss the fact that on the near 80th anniversary of the UN, which will be next year, multilateralism is not working right now. And the institutions of the UN are not able to achieve their objectives. And even when we have votes, or decisions, I should say, by the International Court of Justice, they're just ignored. We had a decision in July that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian lands captured in June 1967 are illegal, and Israel needs to leave them. Very clear. That was followed by a vote of the UN General Assembly by an overwhelming margin. The count was roughly 120 in favor of the ICJ decision, 9 opposed, including Israel and the United States, and a handful of small island economies and a couple of other countries as well, and almost all of Europe abstaining, which is not a good show, abstaining from supporting a judgment of the International Court of Justice. How can one abstain from this? How can one even possibly oppose this, except to be an illegal rogue nation, which Israel is, and the United States is in its complicity with Israel? But the vote happened. It was an overwhelming majority. If you weighted the votes by the population of the countries voting, for example, giving India and China and Indonesia and so forth their weights, then the vote was roughly 90% of the world population voting to support the International Court of Justice, and about, or not 90%, 90% of those who voted yes or no, and 10% opposed. So overwhelming majority, completely ignored subsequently by the United States government, by the government of Israel, and, by the way, very importantly, by our media in the United States, our mainstream media. We don't hear anything about any of this. So the world of normative decision-making, the UN decisions, the votes of the General Assembly, the decisions of the International Court of Justice, they exist in a certain realm, but they don't exist on the pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the MSNBC, the CNN, where people receive a great deal of their news. By the way, I don't appear anywhere in those places anymore. I used to. But if you try to say something that is not to the narrative of the U.S. government. Now you don't appear in those places. It's an interesting world for me because there is a lot of alternative media, so you're not really silenced, but you're silenced by the official narratives. And the official narratives don't try to answer challenges, they just ignore the other side. That's how everything works. We don't even have a question period like in the British Commons, for example, where the Prime Minister is at least asked by the opposition a question. When the President is asked a question, he waves and walks away. That's partly the problem of our President today also. I'm not sure what he hears and understands. We don't even know, because we don't hear from our President really almost at all. But we don't have an engaged debate. So all of this means that our institutions are not functioning well, and we need to understand this, we need to understand why, and we need to understand what might be done to change things. So let me give you a short personal view of those issues and then discuss what was agreed in the Pact for the Future and why, even though it's just words, why the words can still matter and what we should do about it. I think we are in a very difficult period because of the number of massive disruptions that we're facing that have overwhelmed our politics and overwhelmed our processes of cooperation. So there are some very important positive features of our world, and let me start with those. I mentioned technology. We're in a period of the fastest technological change in history, and these technologies are very powerful and they can provide a lot of good, but they're profoundly disruptive as well. So they're changing society, changing jobs, changing income distribution, and almost every powerful technology can be weaponized as well. So our intelligence services and militaries are all over all of these technologies. These are not civilian technologies per se. They are heavily militarized already. They're part of the security state as well as part of the civilian economy. But we have tools through the digital revolution that are extraordinarily powerful if we would use them for the good. A second positive development is that many parts of the world have had truly extraordinary economic advance in the last half century. And this is a major improvement of human well-being for a lot of the world. China was an impoverished country in 1980. It was impoverished for odd reasons, actually, because China, of course, had been, relatively speaking, a very rich civilization for most of the past 2,000 years. In fact, well ahead of the rest of the world for about 1,500 years. But then starting in the 1500s onward with the European ascent of dominance of the world, and then especially with the industrial age of the 19th century, China suffered enormous losses at the hands of Europe and at the hands of internal disarray and at the hands of its own neighbor, Japan. So from the beginning of the 19th century, Britain invaded China in 1839 in the First Opium War. Several wars followed. A massive civil war followed, the Taiping Rebellion, so-called, which may be the largest civil war in world history with tens of millions dead. By the end of the 19th century, China was a greatly weakened country and dynasty, and Japan invaded and began to dominate increasing parts of China. And of course, in the 1930s, Japan fully invaded China. China went into civil war, and there were, after 1949, decades more of upheaval in China, so that by the mid-1970s, China was impoverished and unstable and in disarray after civil war, many other policy disasters like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Then China began an astounding recovery, guided by maybe the greatest economic reformer in history, if not, let's say, modern history, Deng Xiaoping, who put China on a path of tremendously rapid economic catch-up. And China became a high-income country and a very sophisticated, technologically sophisticated manufacturing economy, and life expectancy soared and living standards soared. This is a wonderful thing for 1.4 billion people, and it has energized economic development throughout Asia. And now India is on a course not quite so dramatic, but very positive, with a massive increase of standard of living, rising life expectancy, higher incomes, and following in China's wake in this progress. So, by the way, what do we say in the West about China's rise? We don't say congratulations or how wonderful. We say how terrible, you're a threat, you're an enemy. This is insane, by the way. Nothing short of this. This is a profoundly, perhaps deeply embedded kind of racism and ignorance, especially in the U.S. scene, by the way. And it's terrible, and it's going to get us all into further disaster. But before I get there, this rise of living standards is very real in China, in India, throughout Southeast Asia, and in other parts of the world as well. And we sometimes view that as a threat, or we sometimes don't view it at all or don't understand it, but it's a very positive development about the world that could become a general development, because what China has accomplished, what India is now accomplishing, Africa could do the same in the next 40 years. There's nothing that blocks a dramatic breakthrough in living standards, in quality of education, in healthcare, and in other advances in Africa, if the global environment and the policies and politics would work out correctly. There's nothing intrinsic that blocks the same kind of development in today's still remaining poor parts of the world. So those are dramatic and positive developments. So what's wrong with this picture? Why aren't we just on a path of optimism and building well-being? Well, of course, there are massive failures of our institutional life, our cultural outlooks, our understanding, the way that our societies act. And the first one is geopolitical, which is that, and I'll start with the United States, which I regard as the most harmful of all countries in the world today, the most damaging, because the vision of the U.S. leadership is to maintain power and dominance rather than to welcome the spread of well-being around the world. That may sound a little strange if your kids are in American schools or you work in the U.S. and so forth. I know it's not comfortable to hear. I'm an American. I've been studying American society for half a century, and I've been living as an American for almost 70 years. It will be 70 years next month. There's something deeply wrong with American power and how it's deployed and the view of the world, and it's very dangerous. And the reason I single out the United States is that it's the most powerful country in the world. And so what it does has a very major effect on the rest of the world. Well, suffice it to say, the U.S. has been in nonstop war almost my entire life. And we're now engaged in continuing war. We are engaged heavily in the war in Ukraine. We are engaged in the war in Gaza. We are preparing for war with China, God help us. And the American vision of the world is that China's progress is the greatest danger that America faces. This is a mind-boggling ignorance and self-referentialism that makes it impossible to have a peaceful world society. If you can't allow someone else to catch up, to overcome 150 years of imperialism, to overcome the wars that Britain, that Europe, that the United States, that Japan imposed on China, and say, welcome home to a normal, peaceful world, we have a serious problem. So we have multiple crises in the world that I attribute to great power politics, and I do not accept at all our standard Western narrative that this is caused by Putin or Xi Jinping or the Communist Party of China or Hamas or others. I view this as the United States and its allies trying to continue to sustain their dominance over the rest of the world in absolutely unfair and often very illegal and very violent ways. So this is the first problem. Geopolitics doesn't work. Maybe I'll just say, because running out of time, just a short note, all of these wars could be ended immediately because they have political causes. So the war in Ukraine would end the day that the President of the United States says, okay, we're not going to expand NATO to Ukraine. The day that that is said, the war is over. Period. This is not a war of Russian aggression to take over land or to invade Europe. By no means. This is a war that came because for 30 years the U.S. has pushed NATO eastward and Russia has said, stop coming to our borders. And we could not accept for one moment in 30 years any respect for the other side. And now we're pushing, and any day Biden could say to Schultz, give them the Taurus missiles, and Ukraine could bomb Moscow, and then we have a nuclear war. We're very close to this because we have a half-debilitated U.S. president. We have a U.S. and Europe mainstream media which tells absolute falsehoods every single day about what's going on. And we have a direct war between the U.S. and Russia underway. In Gaza, the war would end today if the United States would say there will be a state of Palestine on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, as in international law. And we will not veto that at the UN Security Council as we did 3 months ago. That would end the war. Israel would blow a gasket. What could it do? Every bit of armaments, all the finance comes from the United States. The war would end immediately. We don't have to have a war with China as long as we say that Taiwan is part of China, which is our agreed diplomacy, is historically accurate, and is the most prudent course we could possibly take in this world. But instead, the U.S. is unilaterally arming Taiwan. Okay. I mention all of these things not to get us completely off track, but to explain that in a world in which we are provoking wars, how are we going to cooperate on climate change or on ending poverty or on fighting disease and so forth? I'll mention one other unpleasant fact just to get us started. We could discuss it. COVID almost surely came out of a U.S. laboratory. We know the research, we know the funding, we know the NIH proposals, we know the U.S.-China program, we know the cooperation between the University of North Carolina and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We even know exactly the game plan because it was leaked in a proposal called the Diffuse proposal. We know that it was funded by other means, even though that proposal was turned down. So even COVID is the result of 30 years of biowarfare under Tony Fauci's leadership at NIH, because he was the one responsible in the National Institutes for Allergies and Infectious Disease of running the Defense Department program. So this is a problem. It's a mess. Everything you've heard about it is lies from the U.S. government. Whether what I'm saying is true, I can only say it's 99%, because only the CIA knows for sure. They have hidden every fact, but we have now a stream of whistleblowers and others who have provided a huge amount of the documentation, but the final bits are not known because the labs that did this work have never shown their work, their files, their emails, and nobody asked them any questions, because in the U.S. you're not really allowed to ask these questions, no matter whether you're in Congress or any other place. So just a footnote on that. So our geopolitical environment is terrible. I'll give you another metric to cheer you up. I see everybody's faces, so cheer it up. What's the matter, Sonia? I know, but I need to just explain why we're in such a grim situation. Every country is supposed to have an SDG plan. Every country is supposed to present its plan to other countries in a process called the High-Level Political Forum. There are 193 UN member states, and 188 of them have done this, including Italy, of course. These are called voluntary national reviews. 5 countries have never had a voluntary national review: Haiti, South Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar, and the United States of America. Can you imagine? The U.S., the host of the United Nations, the host country, the largest economy in the world at market prices, never even tried to say we are interested in the SDGs. So how much progress can you make if the lead country, the one that has the veto at the IMF and the World Bank, and that dominates the other institutions, doesn't even recognize these goals as a matter of national policy, which is true? And why is that? Well, 2 reasons. One, the only thing the U.S. is really interested in at a governmental level is power. And second, the whole U.S. system is designed to protect wealthy taxpayers from anybody asking for anything, including the poorest people in the world. So the insulation of the billionaires from the poorest people is the design of the U.S. Constitution, I'm afraid. And it's working very effectively. The only thing the billionaires pay for is elections. So you can read the list of which billionaires are on Harris's side, which billionaires are on Trump's side. It's a pretty even balance. They don't care who wins because both of them are committed to keeping their taxes low. So it doesn't really matter. That's the game. So, given all of this, we don't have a functioning UN in the way that it should. It doesn't stop everything. The UN is 193 countries. I'm talking about one of them. It happens to be the largest funder of the UN. And if other countries try to fund the UN, the US says, no, you can't. You need our approval. So it's also got the veto. It's not interested in a strong UN. It's not interested in strong international institutions right now. It used to dominate them, but it can't dominate them. So it's out to weaken them rather than to make them effective. Now, most of the other 192 countries want this to change. That's why we have things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Pact for the Future, because there actually is a vast majority of the world that wants a better future. Because after all, only one country is seeking global hegemony in a delusional way. That's the US. No one else is. So everyone else would like the world more or less to work so that we don't ruin everything. It would, by the way, work if Europe would do its job. What Europe is doing is supporting the United States. If the United States says, go to war, Europe will go to war. If the United States says Putin invaded rather than we tried to expand NATO, everyone in Europe will say the same thing. If I say that to a European leader, they say, Jeff, it's really tough for us in Washington. Come on, this is Europe. This is the civilization that is 10 times older, 100 times more sophisticated, and shouldn't be repeating every lie. And yet, we don't hear a counterweight from Europe on almost any of this. Europe's following the US in bashing China. It's breaking relations with China. It's imposing tariffs on China. Your prime minister was beckoned to the Oval Office so that Biden could tell her, get out of the Belt and Road program. And she came back and the next week got out of the Belt and Road program to show what a loyal ally she is. That's how it's working right now. That's not global cooperation. That's not effective right now. So this is really the biggest issue, is global cooperation and moving from an environment of war to one of peaceful cooperation. And it will happen if we don't blow ourselves up in the interim. So the biggest danger of all is that we keep hearing our politicians making the most reckless statement a politician can make, which is, don't let Putin bluff us. Don't worry about nuclear arms. If you ever stop worrying about nuclear weapons, you lost the entire narrative. You lost the entire script. Because this is by far the greatest risk that we face, that all of this spills over into some unbelievable disaster, and we're not far from it at all. We're not far from a nuclear war in the Middle East. We're not far from a nuclear war in Europe because of Ukraine. And nobody negotiates. Everyone just points how evil. Even your new High Representative for External Affairs, Kallas. She says we should defeat Russia, we should divide Russia into little pieces. Good luck, ladies and gentlemen. 6,000 nuclear warheads on their side. Don't try it, please. Not a good idea. So what happened last month? What happened is another, I'm going to finish now. What happened is another high-level declaration, like Mauricio said. A very good one, 56 action points, none of which will get done unless we change our attitude towards global cooperation, every one of which the U.S. alone can veto. They require institutional changes. They require the United States not using its veto. And the U.S. built in its veto all over the international system. Of course, it has a veto at the UN, but it has a veto at the IMF. It has a veto at the World Bank. And this is the basic issue. 5 areas, and I am going to stop, so just 30 seconds. 1, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by providing financing. 2nd, to achieve peace by moving to a geopolitics of peace rather than under the UN Charter. 3, to make the digital revolution work for all and to protect human rights and privacy in the context of the new digital revolution. 4th, to ensure a quality education, including a moral education, for young people around the world. And 5th, to reform the UN institutions themselves, starting with the UN Security Council. 56 points, you can find them online. They're impressive, by the way. The UN is very good at setting objectives. And I don't mean that in a derisory way or in a cynical way. It's incredible. Actually, most of the world agrees on the way forward. And what they come up with in the Paris Agreement or in the Sustainable Development Goals or in the Pact for the Future is really good. It's the kind of world you want for your children and grandchildren. It's not stupid, it's not naive, it's not wrong, it's not utopian. It's actually very practical. So the issue that Mauricio asked me, I don't have an answer to. How are we going to get it done? Except my answer is that we especially make sure that those who are clinging on to power in a reckless way start looking at well-being rather than power as their objective.